There are things a tide teaches a man that no school ever could. It teaches you patience first. Twice a day the water comes up over the flats, and twice a day it goes back out. And there isn't a thing in the world you can do to hurry it or hold it. My father used to say the sea keeps its own books, and a wise man learns to read them instead of arguing with them. I've spent 74 years on this cove learning to read those books, and the one thing the water never once taught me, the one thing I had to learn from my own two sons, is that the people who share your blood can look you square in the eye and decide you're worth less than the dirt under their shoes. My name is Asa Whitcomb. I was born in the gray house up the hill above Senate Harbor, here on the western reach of Penobscot Bay in Waldo County, Maine. And for most of my life, I built boats and hauled traps and asked very little of anybody. I'm telling you this story now, while the kettle's on and the fog is burning off the water, because somebody ought to know how it all came apart, and how the most worthless thing I owned turned out to be the only thing that mattered. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The boathouse sits at the bottom of the hill, right at the edge of the water, on a little spit of granite and mud that my father bought back in 1947, when land down on the shore was considered a liability and nobody but a fool would want it. It's a long, low building, cedar shingled and silver with age, with a hand-cranked marine railway running out of its big seaward doors and down into the cove. My father, Ephraim Whitcomb, built it with his own hands a year before I was born, and inside it I learned everything I know. I learned to steam oak ribs over a kettle until they bent like taffy. I learned to read the grain of a plank the way other men read scripture. I learned that a hull is just a promise you make to the sea, that you'll come home, and that the promise is only as good as the man who fastened the last screw. I want you to understand what that building was to me, because my sons never did. To them it was an eyesore, a tax bill, a thing that would have to be dealt with eventually. To me it was the whole architecture of my life. My father died in that boathouse, sitting in his chair by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, looking out at the tide. My wife, Marin, used to bring me sandwiches there at noon and sit on an overturned bucket and tell me about her morning. And the smell of fresh-cut cedar still brings her back to me clearer than any photograph ever could. 41 years we were married. She's been gone 11 of them now. And there are days I still talk to her out loud in that boathouse. And the only one who answers is the water slapping against the pilings. So you'll forgive me if I say the boathouse was never worthless. It was the most valuable thing I owned long before anybody discovered why. I should tell you about the work, because the work is the bones of who I am. A lobsterman's life is governed by weather and luck and the temperament of a creature that has no opinion of you whatsoever. You're up before the sun. Every morning the bay will let you go out, and you run your string of traps the same way your father ran his and his father before him. It is cold, wet, repetitive, dangerous work, and it builds a particular kind of man, a man who keeps his mouth shut and his lines clear and his word good. Because out on the water your word is the only currency that means anything. When I wasn't on the water, I was in the boathouse, building. I built peapods and dories and skiffs, and twice in my life I built a full friendship sloop, the broad-beam gaff-rigged workboats this coast was famous for 100 years ago. People came from 3 states away to have me build them a boat, because I built them the way my father taught me, fastened to last 100 years. The town knew what I was. Down at the co-op, where we sold our catch and drank our coffee and complained about the price of bait, the younger fellows called me Mr. Whitcomb without being told to. Dale Frost, the harbor master, never once made a decision about the inner harbor without rowing out to ask my opinion first. When the Historical Society wanted to know how the old marine railway worked, they came to me. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you so you'll understand the size of the distance between the man the town saw and the man my own family decided I was. My father taught me the trade the way you teach a religion, not with lectures but with repetition, with cold mornings and your hands learning what your head couldn't hold yet. He'd stand behind me at the bench with his pipe gone cold in his teeth and watch me ruin a plank. And he wouldn't say a word, and then he'd take the spoke of Chave out of my hand and do it once slow and hand it back. "Don't fight the wood, Asa," he'd say. "Find the way it already want to go and help it." I must have heard him say that 1,000 times before I understood he wasn't only talking about wood. He was a quiet man, my father. He'd lost 2 brothers to the water before he was 20, and it had left a stillness in him. And that stillness went into every boat he built, and into me. He never raised his voice, and he never broke his word, and he never, not once in his life, explained himself to a man who hadn't earned the explanation. I used to think that was hardness. I know now it was a kind of mercy. He was saving his words for things that mattered, and leaving the rest of time. And Marin, I have to tell you about Marin, or none of the rest of it will mean what it ought to. She came to Santa Harbor as a school teacher the summer I was 26, from down in Portland, and the whole town agreed she'd last one winter and go home. She lasted 41 years. She used to say she'd married the Boathouse, and I'd come along with it as part of the deal, and there was more truth in that than either of us liked to admit. She kept the books for the boat work. She had a head for figures I never did, and she kept them in a tin bread box on the shelf above the bench, and she'd sit on that overturned bucket at noon with the bread box in her lap, sorting receipts, telling me who in town had died, or married, or made a fool of themselves, while I planked a hull 6 feet away and pretended I wasn't hanging on every word. That was happiness. I didn't know to call it that at the time. You almost never do, because at home, in my own blood, I was a relic. I was the old man who smelled like bait and varnish, who couldn't follow Derek's talk about leverage and equity and exit strategy, who didn't understand why anybody would want to live anywhere but here. I was a thing to be managed. There's a loneliness particular to being the one who stayed. The ones who leave, they get to remember the place however they like, frozen, gilded, smaller than it was. But the one who stays watches it change in real time. I watch the canneries close, and the young families move inland for work, and the summer people buy up the saltwater farms one by one, and tear down the fish houses to put up lawns nobody walks on. I watch my own road go quiet, and I stayed, and I kept the boathouse standing and the railway greased and the traps in good repair, and there were whole winters where the only voices I heard that weren't on the radio belonged to men at the co-op and my dead wife, who I'll admit I still talk to more than is probably healthy. A man can be surrounded by the place he loves most in the world and still be lonesome down to the bone. I won't pretend I wasn't. It made me an easy target, looking back. A lonely old man is a soft thing to push. I had 2 sons. I still do, I suppose, in the technical sense. Derek is the elder. He left Santa Harbor at 18 and never really came back, not in the way that counts. He went to Boston and got into commercial real estate, and somewhere along the way he learned to wear his contempt for where he came from like a good suit. He married a woman named Sloan, who is sharp and bright, and looks at this whole coast, the working harbor, the co-op, the men with cracked hands, the way you look at something on the bottom of a tide pool. Derek did well for a long time. New money, the kind that comes fast and leaves faster. He drove cars that cost more than my house, and he never once, in 20 years, offered to help me crank a single boat down that railway. Toby, is the younger, and Toby is the one the story is going to break your heart over. So brace yourself early. Toby stayed closer. He sailed an hour up the coast, did all right for himself selling insurance, married a good woman who passed too young, and left him to raise their daughter Nell on his own. Toby has a good heart buried under a weak spine, and a man like that is the most dangerous kind, because he'll let a stronger will steer him straight into something terrible and tell himself the whole time he had no choice. And then there's Nell, my granddaughter, 16 now, all elbows and opinions. The only one of them who ever asked me to teach her anything. She'd come down to the boathouse summers, and I'd put a chisel in her hand and show her how to cut a rabbit, and she'd get that line right between her eyebrows that her grandmother used to get, and for a few hours the boathouse wouldn't be so quiet. I want you to hold on to Nell. She matters more than all the deeds and dollars I'm about to tell you about. Now, here's the foolish thing I did, and I'll own it, because a man ought to own his mistakes the same as his work. When Marin died, I came apart for a while. I won't pretend otherwise. And in that bad year, Derek came up from Boston with a folder of papers and a soft, reasonable voice, and he explained to me that for estate planning purposes, that was the phrase, estate planning, it would be smart to deed the big house up the hill over to him and Toby while I was still living. It would avoid probate, he said. It would protect me. It would keep the lawyers from eating everything when I was gone. And I was tired. and I was grieving, and Derek had a way of making you feel slow if you asked too many questions. So I signed. I deeded the homestead, the gray house, the 8 acres of pasture, and woods behind it, the whole upland, over my 2 sons jointly, with a life estate reserved for me, meaning I could live there until I died, and then it was theirs free and clear. I kept one thing for myself. One thing I did not put in the deed, because Derek waved it off as not worth the trouble of a separate conveyance. The boathouse, and the little spit of shore it sits on. Nobody wants that, Dad, he said, laughing, not even looking up from his papers. That's not an asset. That's a cleanup cost. Keep your shack. I kept my shack. You see now where this is going. But you don't yet see how far, and that's the part that took even me by surprise. The trouble started, as trouble on this coast often does, with money that wasn't mine being chased by people I didn't trust. It was a raw afternoon in the back end of March, ice still in the cove, when Derek's car came down the hill. I heard it before I saw it, that low, expensive growl that doesn't belong on a dirt road, and I came out of the boathouse wiping my hands on a rag, and there he was, Derek, in a coat that cost more than my truck, and Sloan beside him in sunglasses, though there wasn't a lick of sun, and a third man I didn't know, younger, smiling the kind of smile that's been to a class to learn how to smile. Dad, Derek said, like the word was a chore, this is Spencer. Spencer Vane. He's with Crown Harbor Partners. Spencer Vane stuck out a hand that had never hauled a trap in its life. Mr. Wickham. Real honor. Your family's been on this water a long time. I shook it because my mother raised me to, but I knew right then. You spend your life reading weather, and you learn to read men too, and Spencer Vane had the look of a high tide coming for low ground. They wanted to show me something, Derek said. They had it all on a tablet, a glowing picture of the future. Crown Harbor Partners have been quietly buying up the old Pendexter parcel, 42 acres of shorefront that ran north of my cove around the point, land that had been in another family for generations, and had finally come up for sale when the last of them died off. 42 acres of pine and ledge, and a half-mile of granite shoreline. And on that glowing screen, where the Pendexter woods had always been, was a marina, 48 slips, a clubhouse with a restaurant, 18 shorefront residences starting, Spencer said with that smile, at $1.9 million each. It's going to transform this whole harbor, Mr. Wickham, Spencer said. Bring real money in, real jobs. He had a way of talking. That man, where every sentence was already an agreement you'd somehow made. He talked about the community and meant the 18 people who could afford a residence. He talked about stewardship while showing me a picture of the Pendexter woods with all the trees gone. He told me the marina would have a heritage theme and that they want to put up interpretive signage about the old fishing days. And I understood that his version of the future of the work I'd done my whole life would be a story on a sign, something the residents could read on their way to the restaurant, the way you'd read about an animal that wasn't around anymore. I looked at the picture a long time. Then I looked at the actual shore, the real one, gray and patient under gray sky, and I said the only honest thing I could think of, that's a lot of slips for a harbor that ices over 4 months a year. Sloan made a small sound through her nose. Derek's jaw tightened. But Spencer just laughed, easy, like I'd told a joke. We've got engineering on the ice. Don't you worry about that. I poured them coffee they didn't drink, and I watched them not drink it, and the whole time I was doing the arithmetic in my head that none of them knew I could do, because I'd lived on this water 74 years, and I knew exactly what was wrong with their beautiful picture, and I knew that they didn't know I knew, and there's a strange kind of power in that, the power of an underestimated man, which is the oldest power there is. Spencer Vane sat in my kitchen describing his future to me, as if I were a small obstacle that good manners would smooth away, and I nodded, and I refilled his cup, and I said nothing at all. What they wanted from me, it turned out, was simple. The Pendexter parcel was beautiful, but it had a problem nobody mentioned out loud that afternoon, but that I'd known about my whole life the way you know the shape of your own hand. I just smiled and made coffee for them and let them talk, and I did not tell them what I knew. Marin always said my best quality, and my worst was the same one. I can keep my mouth shut through anything. Derek did the talking after Spencer left. He'd had some setbacks, he said. In that careful way, that means a man has lost a great deal of money. The Boston market had turned on him. He needed this deal. He and Toby were going to sell their interest, the family's shorefront position, he called it, to Crown Harbor as part of the assemblage, and would clear his debts and set them all up, and all I had to do was be reasonable. I noticed he wouldn't say how much he owed. A man will tell you almost anything before he'll tell you that. But I could see it on him, the way you can see weather coming. The new coat that couldn't quite cover the worry underneath, the way his eyes kept going to his phone, the slight tremor of a man who has bet more than he has and is waiting on a card. Derek had always been a confident one, the one who left, the one who knew better. And here he was in his dead mother's kitchen, frightened, asking his fisherman father for help in the only language he had, which was a language of leverage and assets and being reasonable. I almost felt for him. I want you to know that. Before what came next, I almost felt for my son. About what? I asked, and that's when Sloane took off her sunglasses, and I saw that this was really her idea, the way these things so often are, about the living situation. Asa, she said, the house. It's an asset now. It needs to be part of the deal. I told them I had a life estate. I told them I had the right to live in that house until I died, in plain black ink, drawn up by Derek's own lawyer. We know, Sloane said. We're not asking you to break it. We're asking you to release it. There's a number, a good number. You be comfortable, somewhere appropriate, somewhere with people your age and the right kind of care. A home, I said. You want to put me in a home. A community, she said. The fog was coming off the bay behind them while they sat at my wife's kitchen table and explained to me, with numbers, why it was time for me to leave the place I was born. I had built boats that crossed oceans. I had buried my father and my wife in the church in this town. And my son sat across from me and could not meet my eyes while his wife explained the number. I said no. Of course I said no. I should have known they'd already decided the no didn't matter. The reckoning came on a Sunday in April, and they made it a family occasion, which is its own particular cruelty. Derek called it a family meeting. He drove up from Boston, and Toby came down from Cameron with Nell, and they all gathered in the front room of the gray house, my house, the house I was born in, and they had a lawyer there, not Edwin Pruitt, who'd handled my father's affairs and mine for 40 years. A new one, younger, Derek's man, down from the city, with a leather folder and a way of saying Mr. Whitcomb that made it clear he'd been told I was difficult. I came up from the Boathouse for it. I'd been down there since before light. Working on the sloop, I'll get the sloop, and I came up smelling of cedar and lamp oil, and I saw the way Sloane's eyes flicked over my work clothes, cataloging the smell, and I understood that part of what was about to happen was about exactly that, about the fact that I smelled like work and they smelled like money, and they decided which one was worth more. They had papers. They always have papers, people like that, a release of my life estate, a voluntary agreement to relocate. They'd even picked the place, a facility 2 hours inland, away from the water, away from everything I'd ever known. And I understood that too, that the water had to be taken from me on purpose, because as long as I could see the cove, I'd never agree to anything. Derek did most of the talking, but it was Sloane's hand on the wheel. They told me the deal would fall through without the house. They told me Derek would lose everything. And here Derek looked at the floor, and that the family would be ruined, and that one stubborn old man was standing in the way of all their futures out of pure selfishness. And they had brought a witness, which is the detail that still turns my stomach. Sitting off to the side, uncomfortable in his Sunday coat, was Harlando, the real estate man from up in Belfast they'd hired to value the family holdings. A nice enough fellow who'd done business with the family before and clearly hadn't understood what he was being brought along to watch. They wanted him there to make it official, to make it look like a transaction instead of an ambush. So Midas Grace had an audience, the way they wanted it to. Sloane had thought of that. Sloane thought of everything. You've had your life, Dad, Derek said. You've had this place your whole life. Now it's our turn. You can't just sit on it until you die and leave us with nothing. I deeded you the house, I said. I deeded you 8 acres. I kept the boathouse. That boathouse, Sloane said, and she actually laughed, a short, bright sound like a dropped coin, is going to cost more to tear down than it's worth. It's a liability. Asa. It's rotting. There are probably code violations and back taxes and God knows what. You should be thanking us for taking the house off your hands before that shack drags you down with it. And there it was. The word again. Shack. Liability. Worthless. I watched Harlan Doe shift in his chair and study the floor. He knew. A real estate man who'd worked this coast knew exactly what deeded deep water frontage was worth, even if he didn't know the particulars of my deed, and I could see it cost him something to sit there and hear a working waterfront called a liability and say nothing. He caught my eye for half a second and looked away, ashamed, and that half second told me more about the truth of my situation than any document ever would. He didn't say a word. People rarely do when the money in the room belongs to somebody else. Nell was sitting in the corner, and I watched her face go white and then red, and she opened her mouth, and Toby, God forgive him. Toby put his hand on her arm and shook his head. Stay out of it. And she did. But she looked at her father like she'd never seen him before. And I think that was a moment Toby started to lose his daughter, though he wouldn't understand it for months. You have to understand what it is to sit at the table where you ate every meal of your childhood, where your wife served 41 years of suppers, where your father said grace, and to be told by your own children, in front of a stranger, that your life's work is garbage and your continued existence in your own home is an inconvenience to be priced and removed. There's a temptation, in a moment like that, to make a speech, to stand up and tell them everything about the channel, the flats, the easement, the fortune they were too proud and too ignorant to see, to wipe the laugh off Sloane's face and watch Derek certainly crack. I had the power to do it. The truth was sitting in a sea chest 200 yards down the hill. I didn't do it, and I want you to understand why, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. A man who answers cruelty with a trump card has only traded one kind of contempt for another. He's still playing their game, the game of who has the better hand, who can humiliate whom. My father never played that game. The land doesn't play it either. The tide doesn't argue. It just comes in and goes out and outlasts everything. I decided, sitting at that table, that I would not give them the satisfaction of fight, because a fight would have made it about me and Derek, two men at a table. It was never about that. It was about the truth, and the truth could wait. The truth is patient. The truth keeps its own books. They wanted me to sign that day. The lawyer slid the papers across the table. I did not sign them. I stood up. I'm 74 and my back doesn't stand up the way it used to, so it took a moment, and the whole room watched me do it, and I let them. Then I said, quiet, because I have never once in my life had to raise my voice to be heard when I meant a thing. I'm going to go and stay in my shack. And I walked out of the house I was born in, and I went down the hill, and I have not slept a single night under that roof since. That's the humiliation, if you want to call it that. No screaming, no fists, just an old man walking down a hill while his family watched, relieved, because the difficult part had gone and solved itself. They thought I'd gone down there to sulk. They thought the cold and the discomfort would bring me to my senses inside a week, and I'd come crawling back up the hill to sign whatever they put in front of me. They did not know what was in the boathouse. To be fair, neither did they bother to ask. But I knew. My father had made sure I'd know, decades before, the way the wise ones always do. Quietly, patiently, leaving the truth where only the one who cared enough to look would ever find it. Let me tell you what my father left me. The first night in the boathouse was the hardest. I'll be honest with you about that. Because if I make myself out to be made a granite the whole way through, you won't believe the rest. It was cold. I had an old wood stove down there, and a cot I'd use for overnight jobs. And I lay on that cot listening to the tide come in under floorboards, and I cried like a child for the first time since we put Marin in the ground. Not because they'd taken the house, because they'd looked at me and seen nothing. Your own children, looking at you and seeing a liability. There's a particular cold to that, colder than any March water. But the morning came, the way it always does, and the tide went out, and the work was still there. And the work is the thing that saves a man like me. I got up, and I lit the stove, and I made coffee, and I went to back of the boathouse where the old sea chest sat under a tarp, the one that had been my father's, and I opened it. I knew most of what was in it. I'd opened it before, after my father died, and again after Marin, but I'd never sat with it the way a man sits with something where he's got nothing left to lose. So that morning I took everything out one piece at a time and laid it on the workbench in the gray light. and I started to understand exactly what I was holding. On top were the things you'd expect. My father's old logbooks. A few photographs. Ephraim as a young man standing in front of the half-built boathouse in 1947, squinting into the sun, looking so much like Toby it stopped my heart. Marin's letters tied with string. I set those aside. I couldn't read those yet. Underneath was a leather folder, cracked and stiff with age, and inside the folder were the papers. The deed first. The original deed to the Boathouse parcel, recorded in the Waldo County Registry of Deeds in Belfast on the 11th of June, 1947. My father had bought the spit of shore from a man named Calloway for $200, a fortune to him then, for a piece of mud everyone said was worthless. But it wasn't the price that mattered. It was the description. My father, who had a sixth-grade education and the sharpest mind I ever knew, had paid a surveyor named T.A. Greer to walk that shore and write the deed exactly right. And the deed didn't just convey the upland, the dry ground the boathouse it's on. It conveyed, in the careful old language, together with all flats, shore, and rights of wharfage appurtenant thereto, to the line of low water and extending to the channel of the cove. Now I have to tell you something about Maine that most of the country doesn't know, and that the bright young people from Crown Harbor Partners, with all their engineering, apparently never bothered to learn. In most of this country, you own the land down to the high water mark, and everything below that, the wet sand, the flats, the water itself, belongs to the public. But not here. Maine still runs on something called the Colonial Ordinance, a law that came down from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1640s, and was never repealed when Maine split off. Under that old ordinance, a waterfront owner in Maine owns the intertidal flats, the whole stretch between high and low water, right out to the low water mark, or 100 rods, whichever is less. You own the mud. You own the wet ground that appears and disappears with the tide. And, critically, you own the right to control what crosses it. My father knew that. My father, with a sixth-grade education, knew that 100 years before it would ever matter, and he made sure the deed said it in black and white. He owned the flats. He owned the wharfage rights. He owned the right to maintain a channel out to deep water, granted by an old submerged lands leasing estate that he'd renewed faithfully every 10 years, and that I, like a dutiful son, had kept renewing after him, paying the small fee to Augusta every decade without ever once asking myself why it mattered. I knew why now, because the cove I owned, my worthless little spit of mud, was the only deep water access on that whole half-mile of shore. The Pendexter parcel, all 42 beautiful acres of it, was hard against the water, but the water in front of it was shoal, a wide shelf of ledge and mud that went dry at low tide for 200 yards out. You could not float a marina there. You could not run a dredge channel there without crossing into deep water. And the only deep water, the only natural channel, the only place a boat could come and go on any tide, ran right to the flats that my father bought for $200 in 1947. Crown Harbor Partners could build their clubhouse and their restaurant and their $1.9 million residences. But they could never get a boat to the marina they were selling, not without crossing my flats and using my channel and my deeded right of wharfage. The whole 48 slip dream, the entire reason the Pendexter land was worth buying, depended on a piece of mud they'd told me to be grateful they were taking off my hands. I sat down on the bucket Marin used to sit on, and I started to laugh. And then I started to cry, and I couldn't have told you which was which. But that wasn't even all of it. My father had left me more than the deed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories, like this one. Under the deed, in the leather folder, was a second document, and this one I'd never properly read. It was a recorded easement, drawn up in 1961, the year before my father started building the second friendship sloop. The Pendexter family, back then, had needed something for my father, access across the corner of his lot, to bring lumber down to their own little wharf. And my father, being the man he was, had granted it. But he was no fool. In exchange, the Pendexters had granted him a permanent, recorded, appurtenant easement, the right to cross the lower corner of the Pendexter land to reach the town road. And this is the part that mattered, a covenant that ran with the land, recorded against the Pendexter parcel forever, acknowledging that. The deep water channel and rights of wharfage are pertinent to the Whitcomb Parcel R and shall remain the sole means of navigable access to the cove, and no structure or improvement upon. The Pendexter parcel shall obstruct the same. In plain English, every future owner of the Pendexter land, including Crown Harbor Partners, had, baked into their own deed, whether they'd read it or not, a recorded acknowledgement that the only way to the water ran through my mud, and that they couldn't build anything that blocked it. My father, in 1961, in a deal about a load of lumber, had quietly secured the keystone of the entire harbor, and he'd left it in a sea chest for the one son who'd care enough to keep the boathouse standing. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I didn't, not then. What I felt, sitting on that buck in the cold, was my father's hand on my shoulder, because I finally understood the thing he used to say, and I never got. The sea keeps its own books, and a wise man learns to read them. He hadn't been talking about the tide at all. He'd been telling me, the only way he knew how, that he'd written it all down, and the truth would keep patient as the water until the day somebody needed it. There were 2 more things in that chest, and I'll tell you about them quick, because they round the story out. One was money, not a fortune, but real, a thick envelope of United States savings bonds, Series E and E, that my father and then I have been buying small all our lives, $25 here, $50 there, every good season, tucked away and forgotten. I added them up later with Edwin Pruitt's help, and they matured into a little over $91,000. Enough that I would never have to take a dime from anyone, enough that the appropriate community, 2 hours inland, could go hang. And the other thing was in the chest. It was the whole back half of the boathouse, under canvas, where I'd been working since before Marin died. The sloop, the Marin B. She was a friendship sloop, 33 feet on deck, that my father had started building in 1962 and never finished. The last boat he laid a keel for before his hands gave out. For 60 years she'd sat in the back of the boathouse, half-planked, waiting. And after Marin passed, when the nights got long, I'd started finishing her, plank by plank, the old way, steam-bent oak and cedar and bronze fasteners, every joint the way my father taught me. I named her for my wife. I'd told no one. To my son, she was just more junk under a tarp in the worthless shack. She was, a marine surveyor would later tell me, one of perhaps 3 surviving examples of a true pre-war friendship sloop hull completed in the original method, and museums in 2 states wanted her badly enough to put numbers on the table I won't repeat because they embarrass me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it came out, how the worthless shack spoke up. I did not go up the hill and gloat. I want to be clear about that, because I think the easy version of this story is one where the old man storms back into the house and waves the deed and watches him squirm, and that's not what happened, and it's not who my father raised me to be. What I did was call Edwin Pruitt. Edwin had been my father's lawyer, and then mine, a careful, dry old man down in Belfast who'd known my family for 60 years and had a memory like a steel trap. I drove down with the leather folder and laid it on his desk, and he put on his glasses and went through it slow, the way you'd expect, and when he got to the 1961 easement, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he took his glasses off and looked at me. "Asa," he said, "do your boys know what they're sitting on?" "They think they're sitting on it," I said. "They think I'm the one sitting on a pile of rot." Edwin almost smiled. "And Crown Harbor? Their lawyers ran a title search before they bought the Pendexter parcel. They'd have seen this easement. It's recorded right against their land. Maybe they saw it," I said. "Maybe they didn't read it. Maybe they read it and figured the old man who owns the mud is easy to push out of the way." Edwin sat back. "They figured wrong," he said. "Asa, I need you to understand the position you're in. That development cannot exist without your channel. Without you, those 42 acres are worth what they were worth 50 years ago. Pretty woods on shoal water. With you, they're worth a great deal. You don't hold a piece of the deal. You hold the deal. All of it." He told me what to do, and I did it, and it was the only cruel thing I allowed myself in the whole affair. And even that wasn't really cruel. It was just true, delivered in a room. Edwin drew up a letter, not a threat, a simple notice on his letterhead, addressed to Crown Harbor Partners and copied to Derek and Toby, formally identifying me as the record owner of the Boathouse parcel, the intertidal flats, the deeded channel and rights of wharfage, and the holder of the 1961 recorded easement, and stating, in the flat, dry language of the law, that any development of the Pendexter parcel requiring navigable access would require my written agreement, which I had not given and was not obligated to give, and putting them on notice that any work obstructing the channel would be enforced against. Then Edwin did one more thing. He called a meeting. He invited Crown Harbor's lawyers and Spencer Vane and Derek and Toby to his conference room in Belfast on the grounds that certain title matters affecting the proposed assemblage had come to light. Lawyers love a phrase like that. It got everyone in the room. I sat in the corner. I let Edwin talk. I wish you could have seen Spencer Vane's face. He came in smiling, that learned smile, with his own lawyer beside him, a slick woman with a thick file, and Derek beside him looking pleased like a man about to close. And Edwin, dry as a salt cod, walked him through it. The deed, the flats, the colonial ordinance, the channel, the submerged lands lease I renewed every decade since my father, and then the easement. The 1961 covenant recorded against their own land, the one their own title search had surely turned up and their own lawyers had surely skimmed past, because who reads every line about some old fisherman's lumber road? He did it slow. That's the thing about Edwin Pruitt. He'd been practicing law on this coast for 60 years, and he knew that the cruelest thing you can do to a confident man is be patient with him. He laid each document on the table one at a time, face up, and he explained each one in short, plain sentences, and he paused after each one to ask, mild as you please, are we clear so far? And every time he asked it, you could feel the temperature in that room drop another few degrees. He started with a 1947 deed and the surveyor's plat, the one Greer walked out by hand, and he traced the boundary line in the old language to the line of low water and extended the channel of the cove, and he sat down beside a modern bathymetric chart of the harbor with the deep water marked in blue, and he let them look at the two of them side by side until a slick lawyer stopped taking notes. Then he explained the colonial ordinance, the way I've explained it to you, and I watched it dawn on Spencer Vane that the law standing between him and his marina was older than the United States. Then the submerged lands lease, every renewal stamped and dated, a clean chain running back to my father and forward to me, unbroken, because I'm the kind of man who pays his small bills on time. And then last, the easement. I watched the slick lawyer go very still and start flipping through her own file, fast, and I watched her find it, and I watched her face change, and I knew it was old before anybody said another word. She leaned over and whispered something to Spencer Vane, and whatever it was, the smile finally came off him all at once, like a tide going out. He bought 42 acres on a flaw his own people had been paid to catch and hadn't, because they looked at the seller and the situation, and decided the only man who could stop them was a fisherman too old and too dumb to know what he had. Mr. Vane, Edwin said, mild as milk, I think you'll find your engineering on the ice is the least of your problems. Spencer Vane looked at Derek. Derek looked at me. And here's the part I'll carry to my grave. For 1 second, 1 single second, I saw my son understand, not the legal mechanics. He understood those instantly. Derek was never stupid. What he understood, in that second, was the whole shape of it. That the father he'd written off as a liability had been holding the keystone the entire time. That the boathouse he'd laughed at was worth more than the whole 42 acres and the gray house and everything Crown Harbor was offering combined and doubled. That when he'd sat at his dead mother's kitchen table and told me I'd had my life, and now it was their turn, he'd been begging, without knowing it, the one man in the room who could give him everything, and spitting on him while he did it. Spencer Vane was already gathering his coat. Without the channel, there was no marina. Without the marina, there was no deal. Without the deal, Derek was a man who'd flown up from Boston to lose the last thing he had. Crown Harbor would walk away from the Pendexter parcel within the week. I learned later they took a loss that ended Spencer Vane's run at the company. But that's their story. This is ours. Derek did not break in that conference room. He's too proud, and pride is the last thing to go. He stood up, and he said something clipped and bitter. Well, you've made your point, Dad. As if I'd done all this to make a point. As if any of it had been about him at all. And he walked out. He didn't speak to me again for a long time. It was Toby who broke, and it broke me to watch it. Toby came down to the boathouse 3 days after the meeting in Belfast. Alone. No Nell, no Derek, no Sloan. Just my younger son, standing in the big seaward doorway with the tide going out behind him, and I could see before he said a word that he hadn't slept. I was working on the marina. I didn't stop. A man will say things to your back, sometimes that he can't say to your face, and I gave him that. "Dad," he said, and then nothing for a long time, just the water on the floor. "I knew it was wrong," he finally said. "The whole time, the meeting at the house, the home, all of it. I knew it was wrong, and I sat there, and I let Derek talk, and I told myself it was for the family. I told myself you'd be more comfortable. I held Nell's arm so she wouldn't make a scene." His voice cracked clean in half. "I held my daughter back from defending you, from defending her grandfather, because I was too much of a coward to do it myself." I set down my plane. I turned around. Toby was crying the way men cry who haven't done it in years, ugly and silent, his whole face working. "She won't look at me, Dad. No, she found out what we did, and she won't look at me. And I deserve it. I keep thinking about, Mom would have. He couldn't finish it. Mom would have been so ashamed of me." He kept on, the words coming out of him now in a flood, the way they do once the first crack opens. He told me things I'd never known. He told me he'd been afraid of Derek his whole life, afraid of being the lesser son, the one who stayed close instead of conquering Boston, the one who sold insurance instead of building empires. He told me that when Derek called him about the deal, what he'd heard underneath it wasn't an offer. It was the same thing he'd heard since he was a boy, a chance to be on his big brother's side for once, to be one of the men who did the deciding instead of the man things were decided about. And so he'd gone along, not for the money, he swore, and I believed him, for the chance to not be the weak one, just this once. And in trying so hard not to be the weak one, he'd done the weakest thing a man can do. He'd stood by while his father was put out of his own house and called his daughter off from defending him. "I told myself a story," he said. "I told myself you'd be better off, that the boathouse was killing you, all that cold and damp at your age, that we were saving you from yourself. And the whole time I knew, Dad, I knew it was Derek's debts and Sloane's number and my own wanting to matter. I dressed it up as taking care of you because I couldn't stand to see what it really was." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "It was the worst thing I've ever done, and I did it in a nice voice. That's what I can't get past. I did it gently, like that, made it kinder. That's the thing people get wrong about cruelty, and Toby had stumbled onto it sideways through his own grief. The cruelest things in this world are almost never done by snarling villains. They're done by frightened people in reasonable voices, who have told themselves a story in which the harm is a kindness, who genuinely cannot see the man in front of them, because they're too busy looking at the man they're afraid of being. Sloane wanted money. Derek wanted to not drown. But Toby just wanted to belong to the strong side of his own family for one season of his life, and had nearly cost him everything that mattered, his father and his daughter both. And here's where I'll tell you something about the difference between justice and revenge, because I had a clear choice in that moment, and I want you to understand why I chose the way I did. I could have let him stand there in it. God knows he'd earned it. I could have told him what those 3 days alone in this cold boathouse felt like, the night I cried on the cot, the word liability sitting in my chest like a stone. I could have made my son pay, slow, the way he'd let me be put on the auction block of his brother's ambition. But I am my father's son, and my father read the sea, and the sea taught him that you don't strike at low ground that's already drowning. There's no honor in it and no use. So I crossed the boathouse, and I put my hand on the back of my son's neck the way I did when he was small and had a fever, and I held on while he came apart, and I said the only thing that was true. "You were weak," I said. "You weren't cruel. Those are different things, Toby, and the difference is the whole of a man. Derek was cruel. You were just weak, and weak can be mended. Cruel mostly can't." He grabbed onto me then, my grown son, and we stood in my father's boathouse with the marina half finished beside us and the tide going out, and I held him up the way the old building had held up everything for 74 years. When he could talk again, he asked me what I was going to do with the boathouse, with the deal, with the rights that were worth all that money. He thought, I think, that I was going to sell, that I'd hold out for my own price now and become rich, and that the family fortune would just have a different king. That's how Derek thought. That's how Sloan thought. They couldn't imagine a man holding the keys to a kingdom and choosing not to open the gate. But I'd already decided, sitting on Marin's bucket the morning I found the deed. I decided before I even called Edwin. I wasn't going to sell my father's channel to a man who wanted to put a clubhouse on it. Let me tell you what I did instead, because the building of a thing is always more interesting than the tearing down of it. I'm a builder. It's the only thing I've ever really been. And a builder, given a fortune in rights and a worthless shack and one last good stretch of years, does not buy himself a comfortable chair. He builds. I sat down with Edwin Pruitt again, and this time I came with a plan instead of problem. I told him I want to put the boathouse, the flats, the channel, all of it into a trust. Not for me, a working waterfront trust. There's a real thing in Maine called working waterfront protection, where you put a covenant on shorefront land that says it can only ever be used for fishing, boat building, marine trades, the actual work of the water, and never for condos, never for a clubhouse, never for a $1.9 million residence with a view of men who can't afford to live here anymore. You give up the right to ever cash out in exchange of the land staying what it was meant to be forever. I gave up the fortune, on purpose, with my eyes open. Edwin looked at me over his glasses for a long while when I told him, and then he said, "Your father would have done the same, and I have never in my life been paid a higher compliment. But I didn't give it to nobody. I gave it to Nell. I set up the trust so the boathouse would belong, when I'm gone, to a small foundation, and I named my granddaughter Nell as its first steward, with a board of Santa Harbor people I trust, Dale Frost, the harbor master, among them, to keep her honest and help her along. The boathouse would become a school, a real one, where kids from this coast, kids whose families have fished these waters for 200 years and are getting priced off them one developer at a time, could come and learn the old trades, boat building, rigging, the marine railway, how to read the grain of a plank like scripture, how to read the books the sea keeps. I used the savings bonds, the $91,000 my father and I had squirreled away a quarter at a time, to fund the first 3 years of it. And the Marin B, I finished her. It took me another 14 months, and Nell did a good third of the work with her own hands, and the line came back between her eyebrows just like her grandmother's. When she was done, when we were done, we cranked her down the marine railway on a clear morning in June, and she floated true and tight, the way a boat does when she's built right, and the whole co-op came down to watch, and Dale Frost blew the harbor air horn. And I'll tell you, I felt my father standing right beside me on the wharf, and Marin on his other side, and for the length of one long breath the whole of my family was there on that shore, the living and the dead, and none of them were ashamed of me. I did not give the Marin B to a museum, though I could have. I gave her to the school. She's a school's teaching boat now. Every kid who comes through learns on her. My father's last keel, finished by his son and his great-granddaughter, working the cove she was born on. That's worth more than any number museum could write. And I think my father knew it would be 60 years ago when he laid her down and trusted there'd be someone to finish what he started. There's not much more to tell, and the not much is the sweetest part. So let me give it to you, and then I'll let you go. Derek and I are not what we were. I'd be lying if I dressed it up. The deal dying cost him badly, and a proud man rarely forgives a person who watched him fall, even when the fall was his own doing. He went back to Boston. He calls on Christmas. Sloan doesn't call at all. I've made my peace with it. You cannot crank a boat down a railway that's bent, and Derek been a long time ago, well before any of this, and it wasn't mine to straighten. I left the door open. I always will, but I won't stand in the cold holding it. Toby is different. Toby comes every weekend now. He's learning to build at 51, his hands clumsy and earnest, and he's not bad. He and Nell run the school's open days together. He found, somewhere in the wreckage of what he did, the spine he'd been missing his whole life. Turns out a man can grow one late, if he wants it bad enough and somebody gives him the chance. He looks his daughter in the eye now. That took the better part of a year, but he earned it back one Saturday at a time, the only way that kind of thing ever comes back. Slow, like the tide. And Nell, my Nell, she's running the boathouse like she was born to it, because she's going to take it over for real one day. And she's already better with the kids than I ever was, gentler, quicker to laugh. The other evening, I came down at low tide, and she was out on the flats with a half-dozen children from the village, all of them ankle-deep in my father's worthless mud. And she was telling them. I heard her from the wharf. She was telling them about the colonial ordinance, about how in Maine you own the flats right out to low water, about how a man could buy a piece of mud for $200 in 1947, and it could turn out to be the most valuable ground in the whole harbor if only he understood what he was standing on. I didn't go down. I just stood at the fence line at the top of the wharf, where my father used to stand, where his father stood before him, and I watched my granddaughter teach the next ones to read the books the sea keeps. The boathouse is still there. The tide still comes up twice a day and goes back out, and there isn't a thing in the world anybody could do to hurry it or hold it. They called it shack. They called it a liability. They told me to be grateful they'd take it off my hands. It was the most valuable thing I ever owned. It always had been, not because of the channel or the rights or the money I gave away, but because my father built it to hold the truth until somebody needed it, and I built a life inside it, and now my granddaughter is building the future out of it. The work goes on. That's the whole of it, in the end. The fields, the water, the work. They outlast every cruelty and every greed, and every man fool enough to think he's the owner of something the tide only ever loaned him. You don't own the cove. You keep it for a while, and you keep it right, and you hand it on. My father knew that. I know it now. And Nell, out there in the mud at low water, laughing. Nell will know it longer than any of us. The sun's coming up over the eastern point. The fog's nearly off the water. I can hear Nell cranking the Marin bee down the railway for the morning sail, and any minute now she'll holler up the hill for me to come and crew, and I will, the way I always do, the way I'll do for as long as the good Lord and my back allow. Worthless. They had no idea. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.